You can be seated. Invigorating, eh?
Invigorating.
Yeah. Hey, if you have your Bibles, would you turn with me to the book of John, chapter 10. John, chapter 10. We've been learning about the 7 I am statements of Jesus in the book of John. And this week we're on, I think it would be number 4, as Jesus as our good shepherd. And has anybody ever had sheep in this congregation this morning? Anybody ever raised sheep? We as a family did that when we lived on the coast in Warrenton. We had maybe 5 or 6 sheep at a time on our 15 acres. And it was amazing the idiocy sometimes of the sheep. Of course, not comparing that to us by any means. But it would be amazing the way that they would get stuck all over the place. We would have blackberry bushes all over our property, and their wool would get stuck in the blackberry bushes. And they would start screaming at the top of their, flying at the top of their lungs, and we would have to go find the sheep and cut them out of the blackberry brambles. When it would get muddy, they would stumble down hills and land at the bottom of the hill on their back, with all 4 legs up. And become one of those things for some of you guys who are older, maybe you can understand. You get stuck in this position and you can't get up, you can't roll over. And so they would start screaming at the top of their lungs. We'd have to go find them and tip them over. Sheep tipping. They would get lost all the time. They would wander out of the pasture, and the neighbor would call and say, "We've got your sheep again." We'd have to go down and pick them up. They are troublesome creatures. They'd get on your front porch, and they would leave landmines on your front porch. They were stinky. And they were prey for all the animals, the mountain lions we had, the black bears. Occasionally you'd find a carcass left behind. They weren't able to protect themselves. It reminds me of the comic that you might have seen before. These are deer. Bummer of the birthmark Hal. These sheep are targets. They're just so easy, it's not even funny. So Jesus today, he says, that I am the good shepherd, which means that we are the sheep. And we're going to learn 4 things, what it means that Jesus is the what shepherd? The good shepherd, and what that means for us. But before we begin, would you stand with me as we read John 10, verses 11 through 16? We'll read it together. All right. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. Amen. Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you are our good shepherd. Thank you that you're a God who considers us worthy of laying down your life for. In spite of all of our troubles sometimes, God, that we get ourselves into, that we get you into, your love never ceases, it never fails. As the psalm says over and over and over and over again, God, your love endures forever. We thank you so much that in spite of some of our stupid phases and our slip-ups and our turbling, where we land on our back with our feet up in the air, you still love us and never give up on us. Pray these things in your name. Amen. Amen. Let me be seated. So I want to start this morning in a different way. I want us to ask the question, Jesus is our good shepherd. How do we know? How do we know that Jesus was here, that he walked this planet, that he is real, that he was really here? And I think there's 3 really neat things I just want to share with you this morning. Maybe you can share with your friends, or it'll help you. When we see Jesus historically as he really was, as he was here, it makes the fact that he's our good shepherd really settle in. Oh my goodness, he's really here. He really is our good shepherd. The first thing I want to start with is a book, a history by a guy by the name of Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish dude. Josephus Flavius, kind of a cool name. And he wrote about 90 AD about the history of the Jewish people. And he was a Jew and not a Christian. He did not believe in Jesus, but he mentioned Jesus. There's a portion in his History of the Jews where he speaks about Jesus. So I want you to see somebody who is not a Christian, how he describes Jesus. About 80, 90, 60 years after the death of Jesus, this is what he has to say. So it's about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to be called a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many the Greeks. He was the what? The Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standings among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place had come to love him did not forsake him. On the third day he did what? Appeared to them, restored to life. For the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has so far to this day not disappeared.
Wow.
So here's something outside the Bible from a guy who's not a Christian who says that there was a dude who worked miracles and who rose from the dead on the third day. Pretty cool. The second thing I want to share with you is a little tiny slice of a manuscript they found buried in the sands of Egypt, and it's the earliest copy of the book of John we have. We think it was written about 125 AD, and the book of John itself, the original copy, was written about AD 90. And so that's, if it was AD 90, it's about 60 years after the death of Jesus. And you can see written on it, they translate for us, there's a little bit of a fragment of John 18:31 and then 33 on the backside. And you hear sometimes that we can't trust the Bible because this book has been played like a game of telephone. Have you guys ever played the game of telephone? Where you whisper in the person's ear, and by the time it gets all the way around the circle, whatever was said in the beginning is pretty far gone. It's crazy. But here we get a glimpse of the fact that we have very, very, very early manuscripts. And when we look at these very, very early manuscripts, they match what we have in our Bible that is 2,000 years later. Nothing has changed, even from those very earliest manuscripts. And so when you look at that, you ask the question, if John was written in AD 90, 60 years after the death of Jesus, it would be like reading a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. written today about his life, written in the 1960s about his life. So you ask the question, is something that's 60 years old therefore uncredible? Is it not able to be trusted? 60 years is pretty close to the source. It'd be like reading a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's the second thing I want to show you. And the third is this little stone, kind of a big stone, found in a place where Terry, Amy, and Parker and I were just at in Caesarea Philippi in Israel. And on this stone is an inscription. And maybe some of us can make it out. You guys see what that spells? It almost looks like Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. And so before 1960, everybody thought Pontius Pilate was a figment of the imagination of the Bible, that it wasn't real, that Pilate never actually existed. The guy who condemned Jesus to death on the cross was just created out of the blue, and it's in the Bible, but we don't know if he actually existed. And then they unburied this stone in Caesarea Philippi to prove that he really was the prefect, the governor of Judea. So that's pretty cool there. I was just there with some of the other people in the church, and we've been to the place where Jesus was born. We walked in the footsteps of where he taught in the synagogues. I was there kneeling in worship at the place where he was buried and where he rose from the dead. This stuff is true. And when we hear that Jesus is our good shepherd, how much more powerful is it when we see from the extra biblical stuff, from the artifacts, that Jesus really did walk this earth, that he really did raise from the dead. This is powerful because it's true. When you look at the maps at the back of your Bible, there are place names where you can actually go and visit. There are other religions with maps that don't have place names that you can go and visit. This stuff is grounded in history. So all that to say, Jesus is our good shepherd. We can trust it's true. He really did walk this earth. He really is alive. So 4 reasons we can trust Jesus is the Good Shepherd. Are you ready for a few notes? The first is that He lays down His life for us. He lays down His life for us. So in John chapter 10, verse 11, read with me what it says. It says, I'm the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd does what for His sheep? Lays down His life for the sheep. The idea here is a voluntary laying down. He's not forced to do it. It's His choice. And Jesus lays down His life of His own volition. So I want you to imagine, it goes on in verse 12 to say that he who is a hired hand, who is not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming. Sees the what coming?
Wolf.
The wolf. And it says that he leaves the sheep and takes off, turns tail as fast as he can because he has no care for the sheep. And it says that the wolf snatches the sheep. Some of them are eaten by the wolf, and some of them are escapees. They flee and are scattered among the hills. Jesus says, I am the Good Shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep. That when the wolf comes, the sheep don't have to worry. Why? Because there's one who takes the place of the sheep, lays down his life. I want you to imagine for a moment as that wolf comes, okay? And there's either a hired hand or a shepherd as the head of the flock. Jesus contrasts himself. The wolf comes and Jesus lays down his life for the sheep, and the image is that the Good Shepherd is devoured by the wolf. Now imagine for a moment what happens after that Good Shepherd is devoured. The sheep are still there, and what does the wolf do? He turns around and he leaves. There's something in this Good Shepherd when he says that he lays down his life for the sheep. There's something in that act of sacrifice that satisfies the hunger of the wolf. Something in it that makes the wolf say, I've had enough, the sheep are fine, I'm going to leave them. And he leaves the sheep in safety. Jesus lays down his life for us so that when the wolf comes, whatever that is in our life, there is protection for us, and he serves as our sacrifice. So Jesus says he lays down his life for us. There's a most incredible story. I think we have a picture eventually down of a man named Maximilian Kolbe who was sent to Auschwitz concentration camp in 1941. He was a Polish priest. And he was there with thousands of other men. And the SS had made a decree that for every person who attempts escape from the concentration camp, 10 people would die. And it wouldn't be via the firing squad or by means of the gas chambers. It would be by means of being thrown into a pit where you would starve to death. For some it took 5 days, for some it took 10 days, for some it took 2 weeks to die. And so that would kind of inhibit escapes, right? If you knew that if you escaped, that 10 people would die because of that. And there was one man who escaped in July of 1941. And Maximilian Kolbe was in the concentration camp at that time. And because of the one man who escaped, 10 men were selected to die via starvation in the pit. And one of the men who was condemned to death was a man by the name of Franciszek, and I don't remember the name of his last name is Polish. So Franciszek was determined that he was pulled out to die in the pit of starvation. And at that moment, when he was called out, he cried out at the top of his lungs, "What about my wife? What about my kids? I've got a big family." And the commandant at that moment was beginning to say, "I don't care about your family, about your kids," when Maximilian did something. He said, "I'm a priest. I'm old. I have no family. Let me go for him." And the commandant at that moment, to everybody's shock, said, "Okay." Everybody thought that maybe both of them would end up dying just for the offer of Maximilian, but Maximilian ended up taking his place. And I love how Franciszek describes it at that moment. He said, "I could only thank him with my eyes. I was stunned and could hardly grasp what was going on, the immensity of it. I that condemned him to live, and someone else willingly and voluntarily offers his life for me. A stranger. Is this some dream?" Franciszek is on the bottom of that picture, and Kolbe's his picture is above that. Can you imagine what you would be feeling in that moment if you were Franciszek? What? And I can imagine him not being willing to allow it to happen, but himself saying he doesn't even have the words to say don't. How? Can you imagine somebody taking your place like that? It says that Maximilian was thrown into that starvation chamber, and for days after days after days until he was the last one still alive. It says that as he was dying, he was leading his prisoners in prayers through the Psalms. He'd memorized the Psalms. He was leading them in devotions on the Passion of Christ. And it says finally, when they needed that room to throw more prisoners in, they went down with an injection of carbolic acid. And it says that Maximilian voluntarily offered his arm. And with a prayer on his lips, they injected him and he died. That's a lot like Jesus. Somebody who was willing to step in on behalf of someone who he didn't even know. Somebody who, by all measures of the imagination, didn't deserve Maximilian to do that. But he stepped in nonetheless. Jesus, it says, lays down his life for us. I want us to imagine for a moment. We were there, a few of us, a couple of last month. We were in this place underneath Caiaphas' house. That was a dungeon, a prison cell where Jesus would have stayed on his last night on earth during the night before his execution. And you can see on that next picture how they would have dropped Jesus into that pit. There was a hole, it was the only way in, it was the only way out. And they would have harnessed Jesus up and they would have lowered him down with ropes. Can you imagine Jesus on the last night of his life in this place, pitch dark, dank, quiet, all alone? And when we were there, when our tour group was there, it was amazing. I was sitting there imagining, okay, here's a handhold, I could put my foot here, I could get up, and then I could eventually get into the hole, I could get out. And all of a sudden, as I was in that frame of mind, there was this scream that shattered the silence. One of the women in our group, Hasanati was her name, she was a Nigerian American, and she had recently come over and had moved to New York. And at this moment, she, for the first time in her life, realized what Jesus had gone through for her. That he had taken her place. He was in this pit for her. And it got to the point where she couldn't even walk out of that place on her own. She was so broken. And that was, for me, one of the most powerful things about the trip was that moment where I realized, along with Hasanati, that Jesus had given so much for me. I picture Maximilian in that starving, in that dungeon that he was in. I picture Jesus in this pit. He did it for us. He laid down his life. He faced that suffering for sheep. Remember the sheep that gets stuck in the blackberries? The sheep that lays landmines on our front porch? Sometimes we're not the easiest to love, but the beautiful image is that Jesus would lay down his life for us. He was willing to go into a pit like that to lay down his life for us. We worship an awesome God who, in spite of everything we could ever do, never stops loving us. It reminds me of the story of Barabbas. Do you guys remember that guy, Barabbas? His name means child of the Father. Isn't that pretty cool? Jesus, on the day that he was condemned to die, Pontius Pilate, had a tradition that on the festival, on the Feast of the Passover, the Jews would ask for one prisoner to be released. And who did Pilate put up on the stage with Jesus? Barabbas, the thug and rebel, versus Jesus, the Son of the living God. Is that a pretty amazing contradiction between the two people? What has Jesus done his entire life? Good. Heal, open blind eyes, open deaf ears, restore, heal the paralyzed. He is loved. And then there's Barabbas, who is a thug, a murderer, an insurrectionist who deserves the cross, who deserves to die. And it says that all of a sudden the people begin to shout out, the crowd shouts out. Pilate says, "Who do you want me to release to you?" And what do they shout out? "We want Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!" And Pilate says, "Well, then what should I do with Jesus?" And the crowd says, "Crucify him!" Over and over again, crucify him. And it says that in that moment, a Roman guard comes up to Barabbas and he puts his key in the lock and the chains fall on the stage. And Barabbas walks off a free man.
It's amazing to me. It seems like Barabbas has no conscience, no understanding, no cognizance of the substitution that's just taken place. What's amazing to me is that Barabbas, son, daughter of the Father, that's you and that's me. That we, the thug and the rebel, we don't deserve to be let go. We're the ones, if anyone, that deserves that cross. But who takes it for us? And so often I say, as the guard comes up to me with my chains on, I say, no, I deserve this. You can't let me go. But Jesus would tell us, listen, I'm taking your place. Give me your shame. Give me your guilt. I lay down my life for you. That's the beautiful image of Jesus as our good shepherd. He lays down his life for us. The second thing that determines whether that Jesus is our good shepherd, because, number 2, we belong to him and he will never abandon us. We belong to him and he will never abandon us. Read with me verses 12 and 13. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and what? Leaves the sheep, abandons the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand is the ultimate narcissist. He's in it for the money, he's in it for himself, and as soon as his own well-being is threatened, he takes off. Have you guys ever been hurt by the ultimate narcissist? You guys ever been let down by a hired hand? Somebody who was in it for their own good and left you abandoned? What is that like in that moment when you realize that you weren't worth saving, that you weren't worth loving, that because of the trouble that maybe you'd caused, that you were worthy of being abandoned instead of still worthy of being loved? The hired hand is the ultimate narcissist. He's got no personal concern for the sheep. He abandons and flees as soon as his life is in jeopardy. Maybe for us it was a friend, it was a boss, it was a pastor, it was a spouse, it was a parent who, when we needed it most, abandoned us. It was a hired hand. On the other hand, for our family, for our marriage, for our job, we've got to ask the question, are we serving as a shepherd or as a hired hand? Are we, as a husband, serving our wife as a hired hand or as a shepherd? Are we, as a dad or as a mom, serving our family as a shepherd who's in it for the good of the flock, for the good of the kids, for the good of the family? Or are we in it for the good of ourselves? And that's a tough thing to ask ourselves sometimes. Jesus says he's the good shepherd. No matter how many mistakes, no matter how much pain that sheep would cause him, he'd still lay down his life for them. Are we a shepherd or a hired hand? In this passage, what is the wolf? Jesus says the wolf comes and snatches them and scatters them. What is the wolf? Jesus paints an allegory, a metaphor. I think it could be anything really that threatens the sheep. Anything that threatens the life and the well-being of the sheep, Jesus says, could be the wolf. But I think more specifically, the wolf is the judgment that is rightly due to us, that is rightly cast on us by a good and holy and just Father as our judge. That each and every one of us has this wolf coming at us barreling full speed until we get Jesus who lays down his life for us. Look what it says in Romans chapter 3, verse 19. Paul says, obviously the law applies to those to whom it was given, for its purpose is to keep people from having excuses and to show that the entire world is what before God? Is guilty before God. Jesus says that I am your sacrifice between the wolf, between your condemnation, your just judgment from God, and yourself. And the question for us is, are we a part of a flock that has Jesus as our shepherd, or do we have a hired hand who's going to flee in the midst of that judgment and that condemnation, who leaves us standing before God guilty? Jesus, I love it, he says he lays down his life so that after that condemnation, after that judgment goes over Jesus, it runs away. There's this image in the Old Testament about the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16. The day when man would be made at one with God again. All the sins would be taken away. And the priest did this crazy thing. He said that he would take his hand and he would place it on a goat. And the priest would pronounce the sins of Israel and his own sins on the head of that goat. And the goat would be responsible for the condemnation, for the judgment that was due on the priest and that was due on Israel. And all of a sudden that sin goes onto the goat's head. And then what does he do? Hits it in the butt and sends it off into the wilderness. And there it dies somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. All that sin is sent off into no man's land. And when you image this story with me, with Jesus as the Good Shepherd and the wolf that comes as our just judgment, the stuff that we deserve, we see that Jesus takes that. It says in 2 Corinthians that he who knew no sin became what? Sin. Became sin for us so that we might become right with God. Jesus takes that condemnation. He takes the stuff that was rightfully due to us. Think of Barabbas. He deserved that cross, but who took it for him? Jesus. Jesus takes that condemnation. The wolf that comes after us, our judgment, Jesus takes and he sets us free so that we don't have to face that anymore. The question is, who is our shepherd? Is it Jesus or is it some other higher one? Because when the wolf comes, whether that's our judgment or whether that's fear of something happening in our life, whether it's divorce or depression or the loss of a loved one, whenever that wolf comes, the broken relationship with someone in our family, the image is of a God who stands before us, who fights our battle, and who will never abandon us. That's a good shepherd. Somebody who can actually be there and fight for us. If Jesus isn't our good shepherd, you don't have that. That's something I want, amen? Somebody who can be there and fight for us. That's Jesus. I met a woman this week who was telling me that she had felt like she was somehow responsible for the loss of a loved one. That there was something that she could have done, something that she should have done in order to save that person. And she, because that week she had been to church for the first time in a long time, and later that week her loved one had died, she blamed herself and she blamed the church. She had this tremendous guilt in her heart because she could have done something. And she had this tremendous hatred for the church because she went and it didn't seem to help the situation. I love Jesus because it says that the guilt that we feel, the guilt that we've got on our shoulders, Jesus asks, give that to me. You don't have to bear that anymore on your own. I'm the one that takes that for you. The guilt that we've got in our lives, we can't hold it up on our own. Jesus is the one that stands out in front of us and takes that guilt away, far, far away into the wilderness and buries it for us. You don't have to hold that. Jesus takes it. There's this idea in verse 12 that the wolf snatches the sheep and scatters the sheep. I'm a really good escapee. I grew up in high school doing a lot of things and always escaping. Anybody else ever been there? You were the one that always got away. Some of you guys were the one that always got caught. I remember there was this one time in high school when it was one of those moments where you knew that it was finally time that you got snatched instead of you were the one that escaped. We were in high school and my friends and I decided to ride into Sun River. Maybe you've heard this story before. And if you have been to Sun River, you know that there are these parallel roads, miniature roads I call them, that go along the side of the main road throughout Sun River Village. I guess they're called bike paths. But I said to my friend, hey, how cool would it be, man, if we went ahead and got in our car and we rode down one of those bike paths? It'd be kind of cool, right? What else are you going to do on a Thursday night in Pine, Oregon? So we go down this bike path and we see that there's a cop that comes down the road, the main road. And we stop, and we turn our lights off, and we think, maybe he didn't see us. And the cop turns in on the next driveway, and he sits, and he waits. And at that moment, I, as the leader of our friend group, had a decision to make. I could either say, dude, get out of the vehicle, we're going to walk to the cop car, we're going to say how sorry we are, how wrong this was. Or, you could do what I did. Chris, floor it! And he turned his lights on, and he stepped on the gas as hard as he could, and the bike paths kind of swerved back and forth, and it was amazing. The faces on those pedestrians, as we were coming at 30 or 40 miles an hour, oh, the fear of God, and they were jumping, diving out of the road. We didn't hit anybody. But on the bike path, there is a 6-foot ditch to get back onto the road. And the cop at that point was paralleling us on the main road. And so what we did is we floored it and we jumped that gap, got back onto the road, and with the tiniest bit of sanity that any of us had, we realized that we weren't going to be able to get out of the jurisdiction of the Sunderland police in time. So finally, Chris pulled over, and Chris that night was officially snatched for reckless driving and for escaping, eluding the police, went to jail for a night. And somehow I did not get snatched. But there comes a point, that's a pretty crazy story, right, from your pastor? That was a scary night. There comes a point in all of our lives when we got to ask the question, if Jesus isn't our shepherd, when will we stop being the escapees and be snatched? Jesus says that there are people, there are sheep who will be taken by the wolf, and there are sheep who will escape the wolf when your shepherd is a hired hand. The sad reality is that if Jesus is not our shepherd, then whatever else it is that we are following, whatever else it is that we seek our protection from, will let us down. And the wolf will come in eventually, and we will be taken. There are those who escape, and there are those who are snatched. But it's only a matter of time until for those of us that don't have Jesus as our shepherd, that it's us that are snatched. So today, Jesus is inviting us, come into my flock. There's protection, there's providence, there's life in my flock. I'll take care of you. I'm the one that lays down your life. What possible reason do we have to say, I don't want to be a part of this flock of Jesus? I don't want to have him as my good shepherd. Absolutely, each and every one of us can do that today. So Jesus says that he is our good shepherd. It means first that he lays down our life. Second, that he, what? That we belong to him and that he will never abandon us. And thirdly, that he knows us and we are known by him. Third, that we are known by him and that he knows us. Jesus knows everything about us. Sometimes that can be kind of a scary thought, right? Jesus knows about that Sun River incident. Jesus knows all the highs and all the lows, all the successes and all the failures. And yet what? He still lays down his life for us. All of our brokenness, all of our best moments, Jesus knows, and he still lays down his life for us. I love this scripture in Hosea chapter 11. It paints the picture of God as our Father who has taught us how to walk, who bends down and feeds us. It shows this intimate knowledge of God and us. We may have a slide for Hosea 11, or we may not. There it is down there. It says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down to them and fed them. That's the kind of beautiful relationship Jesus as our good shepherd brings. This kind of leading by the hand, this intimate knowledge of a father and a son, of a mother and her son, this beautiful knowledge of relationship. Jesus says that he knows us and we are known by him, just as the Father knows Jesus and as Jesus knows the Father. How well does the Father know Jesus? How long have they been around? Forever. They've been in a relationship forever. Jesus says that I have come so that you might be in the same relationship with me as I am with my Father. I gave my life so that you could have the kind of relationship I've got with my pops. Is that an awesome relationship we get to be a part of? In our culture, when we talk about knowing, it has to do with this stuff here. In that culture, knowing meant experiencing. You want to know what's pretty amazing? When it says that Adam and Eve, when Adam and Eve did the thing to have their first kid, it says that Adam knew Eve, and they had Cain and Abel. Adam, what, Eve? Knew. That word for knowledge in Hebrew is the same word for that deep, intimate love that a husband and wife share. Jesus says, you will know me and I will know you. It's deeper than this. It's this deep relationship. And it sounds cheesy, But Jesus wants more than just to be our head knowledge. Jesus didn't come to give us a set of religious rules and rites. He came to enter into a relationship with us. And when Jesus says later in John that he no longer calls his disciples servants, but he calls them friends, that's what we're talking about. Jesus wants to go deeper than just a set of religious propositions. He wants to be our friend. That's why he came to die for us, so that we could enter back into a relationship with him and with his Father. That's a cool relationship. There was a trip I took in 2016 when I was a youth pastor, and we took a bunch of kids down to Mexico. There was a girl on that trip who the whole time was one of those one of those sheep I was talking about earlier, kind of a pain. She was mean. She was so stinking mean, and she was the gal who had actually made a fake Facebook account on a name of another girl who was on the trip. This girl made a fake Facebook account about another girl, and she posted these terrible pictures and terrible sayings about this girl, and their entire school saw it. And this other girl who was on the trip with us came with the girl who made the fake account. Do you think there was some animosity there between the two gals? And there was this stuff that had to be worked out on the trip, but I remember this girl, the mean one, the one that had caused so much pain in this other gal's life. The whole time on the trip, she was hard-nosed. Her heart was hard, and she didn't want to serve. She didn't want to help. But it's pretty amazing. When we got back into California, our bus broke down for like the 10th time. And we stopped at this Wendy's. And there was a cashier at Wendy's who was a Christian man. And he said, when we all walked in with our faces hung low because our bus was broke down again, he said, "There's something about you guys. You're Christian, aren't you? You got hope about you." And he came out and he spoke with this girl, this hard-hearted girl. And he said to her, "Hey, I know what you did when you made that account, and you hurt that girl's feelings. I know what you did back there." And he literally told this girl everything that she had ever done. And you should have seen her face as it was just her and him, and I was the only other one in the room watching. He was an angel almost from God, who told her the brokenness that was in her life with incredible grace. And then he led her in prayer. And in that moment, she trusted in Jesus. There's a story in the book of John about a woman that Jesus meets at the well, and she was a Samaritan woman. And Jesus eventually gets down to ask her, "Where is your husband?" And she says, "I don't have a husband." And Jesus said, "That's right, you don't. You've had 4 other husbands, and the one you're living with now isn't your husband." And it says later in the book of John, chapter 4, that she goes home, and she tells everyone about Jesus. And here's what she says: "He told me everything I'd ever done." That's Jesus. He knows us inside and out, and yet he still loves us and lays down his life for us. And that woman became the very first missionary to the Gentiles. The woman became the very first missionary to the Gentiles. And it says Samaritans after Samaritan after Samaritan began to believe in Jesus. Jesus is our good shepherd because he knows us intimately, and yet he still lays down his life for us. That's the question today. Do we want to enter into a relationship with this Jesus who is our good shepherd, who lays down his life for us, who never abandons us, and who knows us so, so deeply? The fourth thing Jesus gets at when he says that he is the good shepherd is that he brings in outsiders, and we should too. He invites outsiders into his flock, and so should we. So look with me at what it says in verse 16. Jesus said, "I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd." One flock and one shepherd. Jesus says, listen, there are people who are not of the flock of Israel, who are not Jewish folks, who I want to bring into the family of God. Is there anybody here who is not a Jewish person by heritage? There's a lot of us, right? That means that Jesus was talking about us. We got other sheep who are not of this flock, and I must bring them also. Jesus was outsider-minded he was oriented towards bringing in those who are outsiders. Are we? In our daily lives, are we oriented towards bringing in those who are people of other flocks? People who have other shepherds? Because we know that if people have other shepherds, are they as good as the good shepherd? Do they care? Do they love? Do they protect? Do they provide as Jesus does? No. And ultimately what that means for us is that it's our duty, our duty from love, to go out and bring in those outsiders who are under other shepherds. We've got an awesome good shepherd we want to share with them, and it's our awesome responsibility to invite them into that. In Ezekiel chapter 34, briefly before we close, God speaks about the shepherds of Israel, who are these hired hands who don't have any care for the Israelites. Read with me what it says in Ezekiel 34. God says, shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, and you slaughter the fat ones, but you don't feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them. Jesus says this is life under any other shepherd. People who are not concerned with the well-being of the sheep. This is Jesus' goal. Look what God says a little later in Ezekiel chapter 34. This is pretty beautiful. God says, "Behold, I myself will search for my sheep, and I will seek them out." God says, "I'm up here in heaven, but I am going to send a shepherd who will come down and be the shepherd for my people. I will seek them out. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down, declares the Lord. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak, and the fat and the strong I will destroy. I'll feed them in justice." And look what it says. "I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David." Wait a second. When did David die? 400 years before this, David died. So when God says, "I'm going to set up my servant David," he's talking about the Messiah. The one down David's line who's going to be the shepherd of Israel. That's Jesus. "And he shall feed them and be their shepherd." So Jesus says, or God says here, there will be one shepherd and one flock. And Jesus says right here, there will be one shepherd and one flock. Jesus is saying, hey, I'm that good shepherd. Back in Ezekiel 34. I'm God. I come down in the flesh to be the shepherd of my people Israel. So the question for us today, for the weak, for the sick, for the shattered, for the scattered, and for the dying, do you know that there's a good shepherd who is pursuing you? Do you know that there is a good shepherd for the weak in the room who wants to strengthen you? For the sick in the room who wants to heal you? For those who have been scattered and cast out by religion, there is a God who is pursuing you and wants to bring you back into relationship. For those who are lost and dying, there is a God who seeks you and pursues you and brings you back home. Jesus is the good shepherd. What are we doing to welcome in the sheep of other flocks? In our community, 80% of people under the age of 40 don't go to church, don't belong to the flock of Jesus. So what are we doing to bring them in? If we are honestly pursuing those who are of other flocks, that has to be one of our main goals. There's 80% of the people in Bend who are under the age of 40 who aren't a part of the flock of Jesus. What are we doing to bring them in? Can we, as a first service, think of ways that we can bring those younger folks in? So today I want to close with a story of a little lamb that we had at our house when we were growing up. Her name was Dee, and she was a bummer lamb. And Dee was one of those sheep who you would get home off the school bus and you would shout her name, "Dee!" And she would come from wherever she was on the property and she would run up and hop into your arms. But Dee was a sick lamb. She repeatedly, over and over again, she would have these near-death experiences. And so her name changed from Dee to 2D to 3D because the D stood for dead. 3D to 4D to 5D to 6D. And when she finally died, her name was 7D. 7 times she'd been so close to death, and yet somehow we were able to bring her back. She would get lost. She would fall over unconscious. I remember there was this one time when I came home from school that Dee was at this point where she was so sick that she had to live in our house. She was like this big. She was so sick she had to live in her house, and that means she had to wear a diaper. Can you imagine this? This little black lamb with a diaper on, sickly, but she would go everywhere and she would spring on all fours. She loved life. But I remember this day when I got home from school and she was lying unconscious on the floor in her entryway. And so I called my pops and I said, Dad, 7D is dead again. And he ran home, and I remember when Pops got home, he took this little lamb in his hands. And my dad, who was a deputy sheriff, and who was the commander of the search and rescue team in San Bernardino, California, who took great pride in his first aid skills, took this little lamb in his hands and took his fingers and started pressing on its chest. And then he did what was disgusting. And he did CPR on the little lamb, and you should have seen as its eyes popped open, and it jumped up and started springing all over the house, and my dad brought life back in that little thing. And so often, Jesus, as our good shepherd, man, time and time again, we're 1D, we're 2D, we're 3D, over and over again, we're on the edge of losing it. But in the hands of this good shepherd, there is healing and there is restoration. There's a beautiful story about an old violin. It says it was battered and scarred, and the auctioneer held it up with a smile. What am I bid, good folks, for this old violin? $1. $1. Who'll start the bidding for me? $1. $2 going once. $3. $3 going once. Going twice, going, but from the room far back, a gray-bearded man stood up and he sprang forward and ran towards the front of the room. And he took that old violin and dusted it off and tightened up the strings, and he played a melody pure and sweet as the angel sings. And the auctioneer, with a voice now quiet and low, held the violin aloft with its bow, and he said, "What now, I bid for this old violin?" He said, "Who will start the bidding for me?" 1,000, 1,000, 2,000, 2,000, 3,000, going and sold. And the audience cheered, but some of them cried, "We just don't quite understand."